What is the future of society in an age of increasing loneliness? If we don't solve this from a public health perspective, a lifestyle and community perspective, what does the future look like?
Yeah, that's a really interesting and important question. So, I mean, the trends we're seeing are not good. And we're not talking just loneliness, we're talking about a variety of ways in which people are socially disconnected.
Hmm.
Um, from just spending more time alone, but also more and more people are no longer joining groups, are a part of any kind of religion, uh, are in many ways kind of retreating
Yeah.
from society. So the American Time Use Survey shows over the past 2 decades, people are spending more time alone, less time with family, both household family and non household family, less time with friends. And that is particularly true for the younger generation. And so I think it's really important to understand that this is not just something that is a reaction to the pandemic. It's not just something that started with the introduction of social media. We've been seeing trends that, go back decades, and it just keeps steadily getting worse. That's not to say we don't, I mean, we do see exacerbations around the time that smartphones became, ubiquitous, and we did see an exacerbation around the pandemic. And so, even if nothing changed, it's not looking good, right? Even if we just went back to pre-pandemic levels, it was not looking good. But
Exactly.
there's also reason to think that it might get worse. We are also seeing that all of the many tools that we needed to use in order to cope with the pandemic, right, to socially isolate, we have now really embraced. Um, but these things that helped us cope with isolation are now reinforcing isolation.
Hmm.
Um, but it's not just that. We're also seeing, of course, increasing polarization because we're not out in our communities. We're not engaged with people who have differing backgrounds than ourselves and differing viewpoints. And we don't know how to engage with people across differences. And we're becoming more and more polarized. And so, what is perhaps frightening about that is not just all of the health effects that I have spent my career studying, but we also know that even from kind of a biological standpoint, throughout human history, being isolated is a very vulnerable place to be, right? If you're
Hmm.
outside the group, right? Or with people who are not trusted.
And
And that,
isolation and loneliness are different things. You make that point,
yes,
but they're both
yes,
actually dangerous physically.
right. And so if we are isolated, this can also lead us to a couple of different things. One is we are more defensive, and so we can
Mm-hmm.
act in more aggressive ways towards others that are not trusted. But that loneliness is such a strong driver that it can also lead us to seek out connection in unhealthy ways. And so, whether that is unhealthy interpersonal relationships to even becoming radicalized
Just
and
to be a part of
be
something.
part of a group.
How lonely are we really? When does loneliness go from a signal like thirst to a problem like chronic dehydration? What will the world look like if, in fact, we don't collectively do anything about it? My guest today is Dr. Julianne Holt-Lunstad. She is a psychology and neuroscience professor and the director of the Social Connection and Health Lab at Brigham Young University, among many other accolades. She is also the founding scientific chair and board member for the U.S. Foundation for Social Connection and the Global Initiative on Loneliness and Connection. As the lead scientific editor, U.S. Surgeon General's Advisory and Framework for a National Strategy, she is an expert not only on how loneliness affects the brain, but on how it's affecting society. On this week's podcast, we are talking about how it affects the body, how it affects our choices, and how collectively those loneliness informed choices are changing the face of society. Are we the loneliest we have ever been? Are you? And without clear guidance on when it goes from normal to dangerous, how would you even really know? So I want to start with, as a neuroscientist, can you tell me, how does loneliness change the brain?
I like to first start off by helping people recognize just how fundamental social connection is and how loneliness fits into that. And if you think about it, humans are one of the most vulnerable species at birth. An infant, if left alone, would literally die.
Yeah.
And so not only in that, critical early stage of life, but throughout our life and throughout human history, we have needed others for our survival. And I think that that's an important foundation because it makes sense then why our brains would be adapted to this, right?
Mhm.
Because the fundamental motive of any species is to survive.
Yeah.
And so,
And we
in
evolved to need each other to survive. We didn't evolve out of it, is the point.
yeah, and many neuroscientists have argued that being social is the neuro baseline. And
Mm.
so when we are alone, or if we are around those that are untrusted, our
Mm.
brains need to be more active to be vigilant to potential threats in our environment. Because if we have to deal with them on our own, that's that's a dangerous place to be. But then there's also just the day-to-day demands of everyday life, that if we have to meet those demands on our own and cannot rely on the collective to meet our
Mm.
needs, that's just a lot more effort. And
Mm.
so this is requiring more glucose. It can activate the sympathetic nervous system, which of course then activates other systems in our bodies. And so just for example, when the sympathetic nervous system, this is what most people associate with the fight or flight response, right?
Wow.
That activates a lot of various biological, increased heart
Triggers.
rate,
Yeah.
perspiration, but also slows things like digestion. And but it can also do things like activate inflammation. Inflammation is really adaptive because if you were to get injured, that's important for healing.
Yeah.
Um, but when that gets activated chronically, has can put us at risk for a variety of kinds of illnesses, from mental health issues to such as depression, cognitive health, such as dementia, but a whole host of physical health conditions.
Mm.
And I just use the example of inflammation, but there's dysregulation of a variety of biological systems. And when that dysregulation becomes chronic, that's where we see risk for developing chronic conditions. And so that in a way is kind of the pathways that explain how it is that we see such strong associations between both isolation and loneliness and these long-term health outcomes and even risk for earlier death. And I
Mm.
do want to point out, because loneliness gets a lot of attention, objective isolation is just as risky. And in some cases, like for instance, when it comes to mortality, isolation is actually a stronger predictor of earlier mortality than is loneliness.
Even if the person self-identifies as not feeling lonely, isolation is
Correct.
still that
Correct.
dangerous.
Independent of loneliness, isolation is a independent predictor of earlier mortality.
Wow.
Yeah.
So is loneliness physically more like fear or more like hunger?
In a way, loneliness can be thought of as related to both.
Mm.
And so neuroscientists have compared loneliness to a biological signal similar to hunger or thirst. that it is a signal that a biological need is not being met. And so just like hunger and thirst are unpleasant, but they motivate us to eat or become hydrated, loneliness similarly motivates us to seek out social connection, which is a biological need.
Yeah.
But we also have had some that have looked at it as something similar to pain. It's clearly tied to some kind of issue that needs to be corrected. But so, for instance, you can feel lonely even though you're not isolated, right? And so, in some cases, that can persist even when you have access to a variety of social connections. But I think there's 2 points that are perhaps I don't want to be lost here.
Mm-hmm.
And that is that, similar to hunger and thirst, that we ought to think of loneliness as something that is actually adaptive. We don't want to entirely get rid of it. And I see so many campaigns to end loneliness or to, eradicate. We don't want to entirely get rid of loneliness. Imagine if you got rid of, thirst, but never actually fulfilled that need. You would have a population that was dehydrated.
The goal is to tune into the loneliness and do something healthy about it, right?
Right.
And
So
what
it's
you're
it's really only
describing,
if it becomes chronic,
yeah.
if it's chronically unmet, that becomes problematic.
And I picture like a babies, small babies, and they do all these experiments. I remember there was one where they have babies with their mothers, and the mothers are responsive. And then they have the baby do the same cooing, and the mother is instructed not to respond. She's not throwing the baby into the jungle, but she's not responding. And the baby goes from like to and because it's a baby, I'm thinking, what's that doing to their nervous system?
I actually did one of those studies.
You did?
Yes. And interestingly, when we did this, I mean, it was so even distressing to watch
Yeah, yeah.
because the babies would be very distressed
Mm.
when the mother just stopped responding.
Something's
And
horribly wrong. They know.
right. And so and thankfully, we didn't let it go on too long. But there are others. Some of my colleagues have even studied where they looked at moms and babies. So in part, we were looking at the hormone or neuropeptide oxytocin, which is associated with bonding.
Hmm.
And so in some previous studies, so hopefully I'll get the details right because this was not my study. In my colleague's studies, she looked particularly at moms who had been heavy users of cocaine and how, in a way, how that, cocaine stimulates the reward centers of the brain. And when you think about a baby and when you look at it, I mean, I know as a mother myself that there would be points in time where my cheeks hurt from
Yeah.
smiling so much.
Yeah.
But it's so rewarding, right?
Mhm.
But what was interesting was that these mothers who um, had been using cocaine, they didn't get the same level of reward from interacting with their babies and were not responding in the same way. And so the implications for some of that research is that these early relationships, these early caregiver relationships are so critically important in attachment and, of course, neural development. But we also have a whole body of research that shows that these really early experiences not only predict how predict their social connections later in life. So if you
That makes
learn
sense.
very early on in life that you can't trust or rely on someone else, you're
To tune
not
into
going to have
you. Yeah.
right. So you're not then it's harder to develop healthy relationships later in life. But we
Right.
also know that those kind of early adverse experiences can predict health outcomes even in, middle and later adulthood. And so these early bonding experiences are critically important. And so it's no wonder that we our relationships and our connections are so rewarding. And when we introduce things that kind of hijack that reward center or distract us, that can disrupt and interfere with these really important bonds being formed.
Well, and it makes sense because we're basically just big babies. But if you, as a baby, learned that my parents only tune in to me when they feel like it, then when you grow up and you're an adult and you're around someone who's maybe constantly on their phone, you may not have it in you to say, hey, you're the problem, dude, put it down. Right. And to test that and to build that in a way that's healthy. And then if you tell yourself that's normal, you're spending your whole life reinforcing the idea that something inside me is looking for connection and it's needy. It's not normal. Right. It,
Yeah, and in some cases it might be that you only get the attention when you act out or
yeah.
are misbehaving, and so that you learn to act out and behave in ways that are probably not very conducive to healthy relationships.
Yeah. So people talk about the pandemic and they like to blame it, like you said, for this epidemic of loneliness. But over the course of human history, do you think this is the loneliest we've ever been?
So it's interesting because while we have really good evidence of declines in social connection, there's actually debate in the academic community on whether or not loneliness is actually increasing. And so there are some studies and meta-analyses that have shown that to some extent levels of loneliness have remained relatively stable over time.
How do they
But
measure it?
most of these reviews also predate the pandemic.
Yeah, and
um,
self-reporting and how do you ask the question and who's asking and
well, and that's a really important point, and that is that loneliness has not been measured consistently across studies. So, for instance, in some studies, it's being asked by a single item. In others, it's being asked by a multi item indirect measure.
a
So
checklist.
similar,
Yeah.
like the UCLA loneliness scale is a very common one.
Okay.
And so if you just directly ask someone, "Are you lonely?" or or you might ask how frequently you're lonely, or you might ask how severely lonely you are. Right? You're asking it in different ways, and so you might get different kinds of percentages of those who respond affirmatively. Right? And with the longer survey, we also see that even when across studies that use the exact same survey, some studies will classify people as lonely if they are kind of in the moderate to severe range, and others look at only those who are on the most severe level. And so you get vastly different kinds of, you'll get estimates of 20% of Americans are lonely, and then others will say 50% of Americans are lonely. And they came out in the same year, and it's a nationally representative sample, but it's because they're classifying people as lonely in different ways. The good news is I have been working with various organizations to create consistent measurement. So working with the Office of the Surgeon General, the CDC, and there's now harmonization that will start in 2025. And also, there's efforts internationally as well, because we want to compare how is the US doing compared to other nations, right?
Right. Right.
However, I will say for those that kind of push back and they're like, we don't have a loneliness epidemic, I would say even if we take the more conservative estimates, and let's say, that's more like on the 20% instead of like the 50%,
Hmm.
that is a significant portion of the population that is experiencing something that has been linked to a whole host of negative health outcomes. And so we need to take this very, very seriously, even if it's only at the 20%. That is too many. I mean,
Right.
if you think about the percentage of Americans that are smokers, that's less than that, right? And so we have to think about this as a public health issue, first and foremost.
Most people I know would admit when they're lonely, but I don't know if they would admit or even identify being chronically lonely, because chronically lonely sounds dangerous. Is there a definition of chronically lonely, or are you guys working on what that would be?
Yeah. And so what is interesting is in the research, we see that when loneliness is persistent over time, it is associated with these poor outcomes. The tricky part is in some studies that from time one to time two is 6 months. Other studies, it's a year. Others, it's 2 years, right? And so it's hard to pinpoint a specific time point. I remember during the pandemic, so many journalists calling me up and saying, okay, at what point are we all going to start seeing all of these negative effects? You know, because it went from 2 weeks to, a few
Right.
months and then, years, right?
Yeah.
And so uh, I couldn't say, okay, at the 3 month point, we're all in big trouble. Unfortunately, I didn't have like a specific date at which, there was,
Yeah.
a point of, uh, problematic. I mean, certainly when you think about lots of things that influence your health, that they are often cumulative, right?
Hmm. I remember in the pandemic during lockdown, on my mask and going to the park, Madison Square Park here in Manhattan one day. And I was sitting on a bench and I saw these two women come from opposite sides of the park and they both had masks on. They put their heads to the side, and they hugged and they just held each other. And I'm watching them and I'm just bawling because I'm thinking maybe nobody's even touched them. But on a lighter note, as you were speaking, I was thinking, what if the journalist asked you, you got to tell us at what point this tips over from contemplative to mortally dangerous? And you had put out a press release like, US Surgeon General announces that 92 days of your own company is acceptable, but on day 93, you're in big trouble. Like, you cannot be with yourself for 93 days.
I think that your point is so well taken because oftentimes when we have these cutoffs, they're in some ways somewhat arbitrary. Like, is the person who is isolated for 92 days just fine and the one for 93 not?
Yeah.
It's often these things are on a continuum.
For sure. Without human connection, and we are animals. People like think we're not animals, but we are animals. And I think now is the kind of first time that people have been thinking about it as the existential threat that it is, being alone versus just preference. And so I wondered for you, what sparked your interest in loneliness and was it personal?
So it's interesting because I'm most well known for my research on loneliness, but I really consider myself more a social connection researcher. And I really strongly believe in the powerful protective effects of social connection. And in fact, my research shows that those protective effects are even more powerful than the negative effects
Mm.
of um, lacking. So, for instance, in my large meta-analyses looking at mortality, the protective effects of being socially connected was associated with a 50% increased odds of survival, whereas loneliness was associated with a 26% increased odds of earlier death, isolation 29%, living alone by 32%. And we actually tested this, and this was actually statistically different. So when we inverse it, so one's risk for
Okay.
earlier death, one's for risk or protective effects for greater survival. And so when we inversed them, so they were all in the same direction, that protective effect was significantly stronger.
Mm.
And so while I certainly a huge proponent and advocate for reducing risk, I never want us to lose sight of what the goal is. We want to thrive. Like
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so we don't just not want to feel lonely. We actually want to feel socially connected.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and those are different things because you can feel not lonely, but not be socially connected.
Um, the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, had credited your work with inspiring his push to end loneliness, which is amazing. But your work goes beyond psychology and neuroscience, and you've looked at policy recommendations, and you were on I think it was the Surgeon General's Advisory and Framework
Yes, I was the lead
Committee.
scientific editor, so I was the
Right.
lead author of that advisory.
And you focus on translating evidence into practice and policy. If you can wave your magic wand, what one public policy change would you make to combat loneliness in America? One. Gotta pick one.
One. Okay, there's only one.
Mhm.
Uh,
But I mean, it's done. You wave your wand.
yeah.
You tell me that everyone is required to spend an hour every day sitting outdoors talking to a stranger, or you tell me everybody's required to call their mom. I don't know. You tell me. One
Okay, so
public policy.
the one public policy that I think could have significant ripple effects is, and I've actually written a policy piece on this, and that is establishing national health guidelines for social connection, just like we have health guidelines for diet, exercise, sleep. I
Mm.
get these questions all the time. What are we supposed to be doing? How do we know if we have enough social connection? So
Oh,
from
wow.
the one standpoint, it's very public facing, and so that can help. But the national health guidelines also influence policy, because if you have national health guidelines, now they're implemented in the policies in education. So your K through 12, now that gets part of their health education. It
Mm.
also then influences standards for the time they spent in school. That will also influence employment. It will influence incarceration, right? It also influences the healthcare system, because now this becomes part of the educational training of all healthcare providers. It also now is something that they would then potentially screen for. And so that one thing can have massive ripple effects across various sectors of society and have broad influence on the public as well.
And how do you boil it down? How do you quantify that? There's not a food pyramid for that.
In this policy piece, I go through the evidence that uh, is parallel to the dietary kinds of recommendations. And I use that as a parallel because, interestingly, the dietary recommendations are very clear about what they are and what they're not. They
Mhm.
are dietary recommendations, not nutrition guidelines.
Yeah.
Um, and they're also not meant to cure anything, right? So it's
Good prevention.
prevention,
Uh-huh.
but as I mentioned before, is on a continuum. I
Yeah.
felt like it was more appropriate to have these ranges of what's at risk, what's adequate and what's ideal, kind of in terms of the health range, rather than saying, okay, everyone should have 6 friends and 30 minutes of interaction per day. I mean,
Yeah, it's
like that
ridiculous.
that that's ridiculous, right?
You would
And
have to make a map and you would have to say, well, if you have 50 friends, but 25 of them are jealous of you, you can have like 25 jealous people in your life. You need to have 5 people who truly love you in your life. You can have at least 6 or 7 friends who only talk about themselves, but you know they care. Like, how are you gonna write a prescription?
right. Well, and I do have in there also the like recommendations for quality, just like the dietary recommendations talk about, limit uh you know limit foods that are high in sugar, fat, and salt, right? um
Limit friends that are high in self-hate, jealousy, and narcissism. Is that on there? Please tell me that's on there. That's fantastic. Because it
probably
goes
not in
back to
those words.
children. But it goes back to children. If you were a kid and your parents didn't tune into you and you thought that was normal, how are you going to identify what a healthy friendship is anyway?
Right. And I think that that's also one thing that often gets ignored is the critical importance of quality. And so
Yeah.
if we think about it, even though food and water are critical to survival, just like relationships are, food can spoil, water can be unclean, and even those things that are critical to survival, if they're low quality, can actually put us at risk. And so we have to pay attention to quality. And then
Yeah.
the same is true for social relationships. And if all we do is increase our social contact without any kind of attention to that quality, we have the potential of actually creating more harm. And
Analogy. So this over reliance on unhealthy ways to satiate this need for connection is, I think, gonna is the thing that's going to contribute to, let's say, the downfall of society, right?
yeah,
If we don't
I
get our
mean,
act together.
yeah, and I mean, it's so, in some ways, so similar. It's kind of like all of the ultra processed foods that we, as Americans, when I say we,
Yeah,
uh,
right, right.
are just so uh, ubiquitous in our lives, and yet we, in essence, have a lot of ultra processed relationships.
Absolutely. Highly processed, highly chemical relationships, which are not good for us. Am I oversimplifying to say that the prescription for youth, like preteens these days, would be no cell phones? You know, because being forced to create one-on-one relationships, it's a skill. We are animals. We're not born knowing how to have healthy relationships and friendships. Texting someone is not a social connection. Calling them, taking time out of your day and saying, how are you? And I feel fat. That's a social connection, right?
It's funny because my teenage son, who's in high school,
Hmm.
uh, interestingly, rarely texts his friends. They call each other,
I
and in
love
fact,
that.
it's so funny because they're always on speakerphone.
I love that. I don't know if I love that for you and your husband to have to listen to all their inner thoughts.
But it's funny because I will, overhear things from time to time. But I actually asked him. I said, um, you know, I noticed that you call more than you text, and he said, well, yeah, because it's so much quicker. I don't have to wait for someone to respond, and there's no ambiguity. If we need to figure something out, we're able to figure out where we're going to meet or where we're, what we're doing, and there's no back and forth. We just figure it out right away.
Yeah, but that's wonderful. There must have been a kid in that group that decided to have that impatience and kind of accidentally created more closeness amongst the group because men are the loneliest, right? So,
Actually, that is a commonly held belief that we don't have data to support. And in
really?
fact, there's a large meta analysis, and then there was a recent study, I believe by Pew, but I need to double check, that showed no gender difference in loneliness. Yep.
I almost don't believe that. I mean,
There are gender differences in how um, people go about seeking support
uh-huh.
and in their relationships. So there was differences there, but not in perceptions of loneliness. And so,
Perceptions.
interestingly, because if you think about it, loneliness is that perception of the discrepancy between what is desired and what you have. And
Yeah.
so, what might be desired might differ, but it's really just, are you not getting something that you want?
I'm surprised to hear that there is no gender difference.
And that also might be the distinction between loneliness and isolation. They're clearly isolated, but do we
Yeah.
know, are they reporting that they're lonely, right?
No,
And so we need to recognize that there are clear dangers of isolation, even if you are choosing that.
that's true.
And I'm not saying that, of course, many people do not choose that and are
Yeah.
profoundly lonely, but there is a fair number of people who are choosing that, and so we just need to recognize that there are risks associated with those choices, just like many other kinds of lifestyle choices that people might make, might take pleasure in, but still may
Mhm.
not be good for their health and might put them at risk for earlier death.
Why did you go into this work?
I would say initially I was just curious and wanted to really do research to understand this issue. But I realized very early on that building the knowledge is not enough. We actually need to take action. And so what drives me and fuels my work now is really making sure we put that evidence into action, and that the efforts that we do are going to be effective to improve the lives of people in a meaningful way. We have so much evidence that this not only influences individuals, but also the functioning of communities and society. And so it's critically important, not just for our own well-being, but the well-being of our nation, that we address this issue.
Well, thank you for helping us keep the conversation going. I, for one, feel less lonely after our talk today.